Hello everybody, my name is Jamie McQueen, and the topic I chose for our signature assignment is solitary confinement. Why did I choose this topic? I chose this topic because as a forensic psychology major, I've spent a good amount of time studying the criminal justice system. This has included anything such as the Stanford prison experiment, the case of Jasmine Richardson, who is Canada's youngest serial killer who killed her whole family at the age of 13 years old, and a lot about solitary confinement. Solitary confinement has always stuck out to me for many reasons, including how long you can be put into solitary confinement, how many inmates get put in, and how inhumane the conditions are, and also the misconceptions and the things that prisons can get away with once you're in solitary confinement that people don't know about. What is solitary confinement? Solitary confinement is when an inmate is put into a small cell and isolated. When in solitary confinement, you get restricted from all activities and contact with other people. This can last anywhere from 22 to 24 hours a day, and it is usually used as a form of punishment for behavioral infractions. Facts about solitary confinement. The cells are typically no larger than 6 foot by 9 foot, which is roughly the size of a parking space. Prisons have been putting people in solitary confinement due to mental health reasons, even though they are only supposed to be putting them in there due to behavioral infractions. Even juvenile detention centers use solitary confinement as a behavioral control method. Many of those incarcerated have reported being in solitary confinement for years at a time. It can also be called different forms of segregation, special housing units, and restrictive housing in order to get rid of the term solitary confinement. And the FDC was sued in the 1990s because of its dangerous and inhumane solitary confinement setups. The living conditions in solitary confinement are stressful to the mind and body. The cells are small and brightly lit with harsh fluorescent lights, with nothing but a cot, a toilet, and a sink inside. Often the cells are without windows, with steel doors with a tiny slot to slide the food through, and that's how they also would communicate with the correctional officers. The cells are silent, and inmates are often stripped of paper and writing utensils, their recreational and exercise time, and contact with any other people. The stress and isolation from solitary confinement can cause permanent changes to a person's brain. Studies show that part of your brain that stores memories has physically shrunk after extended periods in isolation. Dr. Stuart Grassane says that being isolated can cause hallucinations and illusions, severe panic attacks, difficulties with thinking, concentration, and memory, obsessive, sometimes harmful thoughts that won't go away, paranoia, problems with impulse control, and delirium. Here I included a little graph that shows that solitary confinement increases the risk of premature death after release. Among people who have died after release from prison, those exposed to solitary confinement were more likely to die from suicide, homicide, or opioid overdose. You can see that the opioid overdose is 10%, homicide is 16%, and suicide is 6% for anybody who was had time in solitary confinement. Study shows that solitary confinement has an effect on those who have pre-existing mental illnesses and those who do not. Solitary confinement can cause or heighten anxiety, anger, depression, insomnia, paranoia, impulse control issues, PTSD, self-harm, and even cause suicide. Solitary confinement does not decrease the chance of reoffending. Solitary confinement does not make prisons safer, and people in solitary confinement attempt suicide at higher rates than others. Some real-life stories that I found really interesting. Activist and poet Ian Emanuel was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 15 years old. Ian was put in long-term solitary confinement for 18 consecutive years. For 18 years, he lived without a window in his cell. He wasn't allowed to speak to other prisoners and was given just enough portions of food to survive. Emanuel even said, "On occasion, I purposely overdosed on Tylenol so that I could spend a night in the hospital for even one night. It was worth the pain." Ian talks in depth about the PTSD he suffers from his time in solitary confinement and how everyday things such as crossing the street was terrifying for him. He now fights for prison reform to help reduce solitary confinement and improve mental health treatments, and he did write a memoir called My Time Will Come, a memoir of crime, punishment, hope, and redemption, discussing his in-depth stay in solitary confinement. In 2014, 29-year-old Morgan Bluehorse committed suicide in his solitary confinement cell. When Morgan was first put into the system, he was considered a high risk for victimization due to his traumatic past of physical and sexual abuse and suicide attempts. While in prison, Morgan was diagnosed with PTSD, bipolar disorder, depression, and a personality disorder. Before his death, he told prison mental health workers that he was hearing voices that were telling him he shouldn't be alive. Morgan Bluehorse hung himself with a sheet in his isolation cell. Due to stories like Morgan and Ian, there has been a call for prison reform over the years. There have been lawsuits, prisoner hunger strikes, petitions, and protests to get jurisdictions to rethink their stance on solitary confinement. In 2019, 28 states introduced legislation to ban or restrict solitary confinement, and 12 states passed reform legislation. New Jersey passed laws limiting the length of confinement to a maximum of 20 consecutive days. These laws also emphasize the importance of protecting people under 21 and over the age of 65. Pregnant people, people part of the LGBTQ community, and anyone with serious medical or mental health disorders. Nebraska passed laws that completely ban solitary confinement for minors, those who are pregnant, anyone who suffers a mental illness, has developmental disabilities, or any serious brain injuries.